duplicating in advance the piloting qualities of proposed new planes. The Ames Center is also responsible for doing research on short takeoff and landing aircraft. This is one of the planes used to test new concepts, the OV-10A Bronco. The United States is very interested in developing a short takeoff and landing plane for use as an intercity transport in the nation's busy metropolitan air corridors. In an effort to reduce the noise of jet aircraft as they land, NASA, with American Airlines, spent 50 hours investigating the problems connected with steeper landing approaches. It appears that by keeping aircraft higher above the ground and reducing engine power during the landing approach, noise near airports can be lessened. Operational procedures for this type of noise abatement are being analyzed. Attacking the jet noise problem at its source, engineers at the Lewis Research Center in Cleveland are supervising tests of a quieter jet engine. The goal is to develop an engine that will be 15 to 20 decibels quieter than present aircraft engines. Jet aircraft to come to a stop on a wet runway. To find out, aeronautics experts from NASA's Langley Research Center in Virginia, cooperating with Air Force and FAA officials, conducted a series of landing studies at several airports around the country. Time after time, runways were flooded with water. Then, ground vehicles and the test aircraft tried stopping on the wet pavements. The increased number and airport ground operations in adverse weather conditions. The scene is Cape Canaveral, Friday, May 5th, 1961. It was on this date that astronaut Alan B. Shepard became the first American to be rocketed into space. Years later, January 31st, 1971, Alan B. Shepard made his second space flight, this time as commander of Apollo 14, the country's third moon landing. With astronauts Mitchell and Russa accompanying Shepard, Apollo 14 marked the beginning of large-scale use of the moon for science. These are some of the 94 pounds of lunar rocks returned from the moon's ancient hills of Fra Mauro by Apollo 14. They are beginning to tell scientists a story 3.5 billion years old. From them, we are learning about the early history of not only the moon, but other planets as well. The Earth, Mars, even Venus. This is the view seen by Apollo 15 astronauts, Scott and Irwin, as their spacecraft Falcon arched over the Hadley Rill, located in the foothills of the moon's Apennine Mountains.
8 feet -1. Contact. Man. Okay, Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley. Roger, Roger, Falcon.
Theirs was to be the most extensive exploration of the moon ever made. To prepare for the July mission, Scott and Irwin practiced on similar Earth terrain at the Rio Grande Gorge in New Mexico. They also spent many hours getting used to the lunar rover. Here's what it actually looked like to the moon riders as they drove their four-wheel car over 16 miles of lunar surface. As a result of their increased mobility, the pair returned 180 pounds of lunar rocks and deep core samples. After liftoff, and while in lunar orbit, the trio launched a small scientific satellite called the sub-satellite to study the area around the moon. As they headed earthward, astronaut Al Worden climbed outside the spacecraft and retrieved film from a pair of mapping cameras. The scientific instruments left by Apollo 15 and the photographs and samples they returned are giving us a real understanding of the moon in relationship to the Earth and the Sun. We asked Mr. Dale Myers, NASA's Director of Manned Spaceflight, to give us a status report on Skylab, the United States' first space station.
This year has been a big year for Skylab. All of the hardware for the program is coming into focus. Our qualification programs are underway. The major elements of the Skylab system are in the final positions of manufacturing and checkout. Now, one of the more important things to me about Skylab is it gives us an opportunity to learn more about man's capability to work and live in space.
(1971), a year of significant achievement in aeronautics and space. These have been the highlights. This special report brought to you by NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
When you think of sea level rise and NASA, if that's the kind of thing you think about, I feel like it's only natural to imagine scientists poring over satellite data trying to better understand what's happening and what the future might look like on our coasts, including right here where I live in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. My name is Joe Atkinson, and I'm a science communicator at NASA's Langley Research Center. This area is one of the hot spots for sea level rise in the country. Even on a beautiful, gorgeous, sunny day, we can have nuisance flooding just because of a high tide. But we'll get back to this area later, and specifically NASA Langley. The thing is, even as scientists are studying sea level rise, the agency itself is having to confront the reality of it. It has field centers in coastal communities around the country. I wanted to find out how seriously NASA is taking this threat. So I got in touch with a guy whose job it is to worry about this kind of stuff. His name is Calvin Williams, and he is the Associate Administrator for NASA's Office of Strategic Infrastructure.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you, Joseph, for the opportunity to speak to you about this. Sea level rise is a very major concern for us. We have about 2/3 of our NASA facilities are within 16 feet of sea level, and that comes to about $20 billion value of infrastructure that we have.
Now that long list of facilities includes Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Johnson Space Center in Texas, Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, Michoud Assembly Facility in Louisiana, Ames Research Center in California, and Wallops Flight Facility in NASA Langley right here in Virginia.
We have estimates that within the next 60 years or so, that there could be potential 4 feet rise in sea level. And so, therefore, we are trying to take measures now.
Now, in broad terms, that means moving to higher ground or, making facilities more resilient. At 2 of NASA's launch sites, resiliency equals the movement of lots and lots of sand.
For example, we've done some reconstruction work at Wallops and also at KSC, where we have stabilized the shoreline and the dunes there. And that's something that we have to replenish approximately every 5 years.
So you have to wonder, is this something that would keep Calvin up at night?
Well, it is at the top of our list. Definitely at the centers that are on the coastal areas. We want to make sure that we are taking the necessary steps to ensure that in the future we have launch facilities, research facilities that can continue the mission of NASA.
Now, Calvin talked about the beach replenishment efforts at Wallops and Kennedy Space Center. But I kind of wanted to dig a little deeper and find out what's happening at 2 of NASA's research centers, Ames on the West Coast, and of course, I wanted to know what's happening here at Langley on the East Coast. Since I work at Langley, I knew exactly who to go to, and that's Loretta Kellerman. She is the director of Langley's Center Operations Directorate.
Certainly, we are a coastal center. It's on the coast. We're surrounded by two rivers, the York River and the James River, and along with the Chesapeake Bay. So a lot of opportunity for flooding and for sea level rise to present itself as a problem for our center. And so this is a big issue for us, and certainly one we've been addressing for some time.
Now, conservative estimates show about a 15-inch rise in sea level at Langley by 2080. More extreme estimates push that number as high as 49 inches, or about 4 feet. The center uses a flood tool as sort of a, I guess, like a crystal ball.
This tool is a great tool developed by our geospatial information systems folks, our GIS team, that allows us to visually picture the rising sea level and which facilities and areas are affected.
In 2011, following a study that highlighted some of Langley's biggest vulnerabilities, the center, which is actually NASA's oldest, it's just over 100 years old now, began taking action in the form of a major revitalization effort. This effort aims to shrink and consolidate Langley's campus and minimize those vulnerabilities.
We've been demolishing facilities that are in high vulnerable areas and building all of our new facilities and consolidating a lot of our missions into fewer facilities at our higher elevations. And for us at NASA Langley, our higher elevation is around 12 foot. And so we're not very high here.
Further complicating the issue at Langley is a phenomenon known as subsidence. The ground the center sits on is slowly sinking by about 2.2 millimeters a year. Now, if you add that to the 4.6 millimeters of sea level rise a year, let me do the math here, you're actually getting about 6.8 millimeters of relative sea level rise a year at Langley currently. The center isn't taking any chances. They can't pack up and head for the mountains, of course, but in addition to squeezing the campus onto the highest possible ground, they're also making really smart construction choices.
The study that we did in 2011, of course, recommended that we build all of our first floor elevations to 10-foot, 6-inch minimums, and that goes into our design requirements for all of our new facilities.
For Loretta, sea level rise isn't just a work concern, it's a personal concern too. She and her family live right on the water. But the communities in Hampton Roads are taking the issue seriously, and the federal agencies are too. So she takes heart in that, not just as a federal employee, but also as a private citizen.
I'm on the water. I always say I'm on the water or I'm in the water, depending on the storm that day. So you just never know. So it is a little personal and a little drives a little anxiety, but I'm very encouraged by certainly the work that the city of Hampton's doing. And I think the things that they'll do will continue to support, and they're very engaged in the federal community here in Hampton. And I think all the things that they're doing are going to help our center as well to try to move water out and away, from the city.
Okay, so now we're going to move all the way across the country to Ames Research Center, which is in Mountain View, California, right in the heart of Silicon Valley at the southern end of the San Francisco Bay. Now, when I reached out to Ames, they put me in touch with a guy named Garrett Turner. He is the Restoration Program Manager in the Environmental Management Division at Ames. And when Garrett thinks of sea level rise at Ames, he thinks back to 1998 and a series of storms that moved through the area. Now, this gave officials at Ames a big scare because it flooded the north end of the center and threatened to inundate a telecommunication gateway facility there, which actually would have shut down the internet for all of Silicon Valley.
We managed to keep that from happening by getting a lot of employees, both civil servants and contractors, to go and put sandbags out. And then we were able to pump some of the water in the channels over a levee into Stevens Creek. After that, we kind of decided that we needed to have a proactive way of at least addressing big storms.
Now, much like Langley, Ames, which is the second oldest NASA field center, decided it needed to look to higher ground. That decision was based on 100-year sea level rise projections.
We are now requiring a much higher minimum elevation for a new facility that gets built. So we have these little popped up areas. And our master plan has envisioned taking facilities that are in that 100-year floodplain and relocating them and relocating the entire campus farther south, which is several feet higher and has a much lower expected impact from sea level rise.
But there is a wrinkle here. It's not just the bay that's a problem at Ames. There's an old system of salt ponds and levees nearby that date back to the 19th century, and they further complicate things, and it's not a problem that Ames can just deal with on its own.
Levee maintenance is outside of NASA's property, and we can't go and fix all of these and keep them from pouring water into NASA.
One thing they're doing is working with the local water district.
We're working on trying to, figure out how we can reinforce those levees and potentially raise them. That we have, a bicycling and walking trail, the Bay Trail that goes around.
For help too.
If we protect the levees immediately in front of us and they do nothing with theirs, we end up with the water just going over their levee and then coming in. So this is going to have to be a partnership, kind of regional with other stakeholders, to make sure that we can come up with a strategy that works for all of us.
One of those strategies is actually to turn those old salt ponds into wetlands, which would help slow the effects of sea level rise. It would also be a return of sorts to what once was.
Civil engineers have it perfectly. In the early 1900s, we drained all the swamps. Now we're creating wetlands. It's kind of reversing what we did before. So it's all part of the same training.
We've had a little change of scenery here, obviously. I wanted to wrap things up on my front porch here in Hampton. We're just a few blocks in from the water, and we're on relatively high ground. Still, worst case, long-term sea level rise projections would have me sitting in the water here. And even minor to moderate projections are pretty bad news for some folks right here in this neighborhood. Just a few miles across the water in Norfolk, that way, the high tide nuisance flooding I mentioned back at the beginning of this video is already encroaching regularly on urban areas and frequently makes city streets a gamble for drivers in all but the tallest vehicles. And so just as these coastal cities are having to deal with these wet realities, so too is NASA. When I set out to do this, I really had very little idea what NASA was doing to deal with sea level rise itself. Now, after talking to Calvin and Loretta and Garrett, I realized that there's a lot going on. In some cases, there are things that centers can do similarly, like move facilities to higher ground to help, but there's really no one-size-fits-all approach. Every place has its unique consideration. Ames has the levees and salt ponds. Langley has subsidence. Kennedy and Wallops have beach erosion to deal with. Staying ahead of this stuff is obviously a big, big job that requires a lot of expertise, foresight, planning, and coordination. Thankfully, it's a job that NASA is taking seriously, and it's a job that will allow NASA to continue its critical work in space exploration and aeronautics and earth science, even as the water keeps rolling in.
Hey everybody, this is Beck, and I'm a maker of music. And like the great Sun Ra said, space is the place.
And I'm Farah. I work at NASA, and I use AI to explore Mars.
And I brought a few friends along who know something about artificial intelligence.
Hi, I'm John.
Hi, I'm Isabel. We are both artists working with NASA using artificial intelligence.
This is Ask NASA.
so Beck, you just released a set of new music videos using a lot of NASA imagery, and I grew up living space, and obviously those images are used by scientists. What inspires you about space, and how you came up with this idea?
Well, the title of the record came from a video game, a really primitive video game from the 80s called Asteroids. When the asteroids were going to kill you, and they were just about to collide with your spaceship, that you would hit this button and it would make you disappear and reappear somewhere else in the galaxy. And I always wondered what that button was called, and I looked it up one day, and it was called hyperspace. So I sort of, it got my mind thinking into music and song ideas. Because I think in some way, I think of music as sort of a hyperspace button. You know, it's something that we press play on a piece of music and it takes us somewhere out of our lives, out of our circumstances. But I did like the feeling of the music, that there was this sort of thread of outer space, kind of wide vista of space and time, existing in the songs.
Artificial intelligence is the ability for machines or computers to make autonomous and intelligent decisions. That can look like recognizing patterns or analyzing images or learning certain behaviors and then mimicking them.
I mean, right away when we heard hyperspace, we thought we have to use AI for this. Beck was already creating a sonic environment that went to like the edges of our understanding and the way that we see. And that's something that we're most excited about working with AI with, that it expands our modes of thinking. And then just the title, hyperspace, literally means to go beyond 3 dimensions. The one that we use for this particular project, it literally works in a 512 dimensional space. The process begins with the AI training on the images. So if we showed it just a few hundred, it wouldn't know that much. But what was so great about working with NASA's decades deep, archive of knowledge is that it could really learn. So for weeks and weeks, the AI trained on as many images as we could show it. I think in the end, it looked at over 25 million images. Sometimes that was multiple times looking at the same images to try and understand these images.
Yeah, basically imagery of anything in our solar system is how we get started in the process of exploration, right? And so when we first went to Mars, or when we sent Cassini to Saturn, we had some thoughts about what we might find based on that imagery, and that's what allows us to really focus down on the type of science we're going to do.
I worked a lot on the database creation, and I feel almost like I could draw a picture of the galaxy now just from going, like anyone can do, just by working with the NASA websites and going through the archives. Like the AI was then able to take that and recognize colors that were happening a lot, recognize shapes that were happening a lot. I remember when it first showed us what it thought Saturn looked like, I was blown away.
Yeah, and even then, seeing these images and getting all the info, it is overwhelming, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about other worlds, we're talking about other realities we probably won't ever get to experience in our lifetimes. This is the closest we'll come to touching the unknown. This project is so interesting because it really came out of the theme of the record. I would have loved the idea of taking sounds from these missions in space and putting them into the music itself.
The coolest thing that we have coming up, which we can point you to when it comes out, is that Perseverance actually has 2 microphones on board, and it's the first time we'll have real audio from Mars. So we'll have audio as we're landing on the planet, so that during entry, descent, and landing, and then we'll have audio when we're driving, or the rover has a laser, and so you'll be able to actually hear that laser zap on another planet, which is kind of something that's kind of hard to even wrap your mind around.
And that hasn't been recorded before?
No, not with a microphone, not this way. We've never had a microphone on the rover like that.
Okay, well, send those audio files my way when you get them.
Absolutely. So on Perseverance, we actually have an extra computer, and so that extra computer allows us to make the rover smarter, and we actually self-drive on Mars. So the rover has to take imagery of the area in front of it, literally build its own map. It can then identify different types of obstacles and slopes, and based on that and its knowledge of where it's able to drive, it decides on the path.
the Mars was in one of the easiest ones because it's where we have the most high resolution imagery. It's been so well captured from so many different points of view.
We've seen the soil on a terrestrial level, and then we also have imaging of Mars from above, and looking through this data set of massive data set of incredible images. Once we trained the AI on that, it was able to kind of produce such vivid, strange imagery, because Mars itself, I think, is so much more complex and so much more deep and varied than we imagine it is.
Okay. So one more cool feature about the Perseverance rover is that it can also act as a scientist. The rover can look at the environment around it, look at all the rocks and say, hey, this rock over there looks really cool. Let me image it, use my laser to zap it and figure out what's under that surface, send all of that data back to the scientists. So it allows us to essentially have scientists on Mars making decisions without having humans in the loop here on the ground.
I think, to me, the idea of space is a bit overwhelming and awe-inspiring. Just the idea of listening to a piece of music and we go somewhere else, our lives change. You know, it's a mirror to this other idea of space and space exploration, and letting the imagery of these other worlds, these unknown places with this music, I think has been really satisfying to me. You know, I feel really fortunate to have you all open your doors to me and my music, and for us to go somewhere with it. That was get my video up.
Sorry, guys.
We'll get it. We'll get there.
We'll get there.
NASA. This is Ask NASA. I mean, that would be the show tune way. With all kinds of guitars. This guitar is actually from 1901, and it has, these are some vintage keyboards. And this is the 808, which is responsible for the sound of all trap music. This is the Moog. And this is responsible for most of the music of the 80s. There's a couple of pedals that I use, little bits and bobs.
By the time the Hubble Space Telescope was nearing its 10th anniversary in space, it had already become the gold standard for modern-day astronomy. Hubble had grown into an indispensable tool used by scientists all around the globe to take an inside look into the universe around us. Everything was great, flawless even, until something unexpected started to creep its way into the picture.
In the last month, namely in November 13th, the fourth of 6 gyros that are on board Hubble failed, and that left only 2 operational gyros.
Lights out. Hubble's gyros, which are needed to accurately point the telescope, were failing. What was NASA supposed to do? Cue servicing mission 3A.
And on Christmas.
Discovery Houston, go inside the cockpit.
Next scene.
So I propose no change, and then you tell us to go up there.
By 1999, Hubble was about to make its mark in the 21st century.
Discovery, go for Hubble release.
And as that turn of the century neared, Hubble was also due for another servicing mission.
I mean, you can just take it in, JT.
Just like the previous 2 missions to Hubble, servicing mission 3, planned for the year 2000, was going to upgrade and refurbish the telescope.
Hey, Store, what do you think about you putting your tether on?
However, without warning, Hubble's gyroscopes began to fail over a year before servicing mission astronauts were scheduled to launch.
The gyros, of course, are required for the science mission. They're required for the extremely accurate pointing. We've homed in onto a wire there that is broken, and we think that is the reason why the gyros have failed.
So, Hubble needed 3 gyroscopes to continue to do science, and by April 20th, Hubble emergency and split the upcoming servicing mission into 2 parts. Servicing Mission 3A would mainly tackle the gyroscope failures, and Servicing Mission 3B would encompass the rest of the maintenance that Hubble didn't need right away. It was now crunch time. Not only did NASA have to prepare an extra shuttle mission, but the astronauts now had to go into overdrive to prepare for the upcoming mission, now scheduled for October. And then, when everything seemed to be more under control, news broke. The 4th gyro failed.
Today, it's sitting up there with its self in safe mode. And that again shows how important the serviceability is to this facility.
Hubble was now in safe mode, which meant that the telescope's eyes were temporarily closed to science. The servicing mission was more critical than ever before. And after multiple maintenance and wiring checks delayed the shuttle launch, on December 19th, 1999, the team of Servicing Mission 3A was finally able to make their mark on history.
And liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery on a mission to repair the Hubble Space Telescope as we venture into the 21st century.
Houston Discovery, roll program.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Houston is now controlling, and roll maneuver is complete. Discovery is now in a heads-down position, on course for a 28.5-degree, 310 nautical mile orbit.
Right away, the team of 7 astronauts went to work. This 8-day mission included 3 spacewalks to Hubble. The first of which replaced all of the gyroscopes. Now Hubble was able to be accurately positioned and stay locked on to its celestial targets. Not only that, the team behind Servicing Mission 3A refurbished Hubble's fine guidance sensor for even greater precision in pointing the telescope, fixed damaged thermal blankets that protect the electronics housed inside of Hubble, installed a new computer 20 times faster than Hubble's original computer, replaced old tape recorders with a new solid-state recorder for greater efficiency in Hubble's data management, and fixed the spacecraft's S-band transmitter to continue to relay data to the scientists on the ground. And on Christmas Day, 1999, Hubble was released back into the stars, ready to uncover new discoveries that lie ahead. Servicing Mission 3A proved that NASA could not only be quick on its feet in dire circumstances, but perform as a team that is united around keeping our eyes open to the universe for many years to come.
We've all played these claw games before where it can be really frustrating using a grapple to pull a toy out of a machine. Well, the success of NASA's InSight mission depends on a grapple. Let's learn about it on this episode of Crazy Engineering. All right, we are here at the InSight lander surface testbed. This is Nick. He was one of the key engineers on the grapple mechanism. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
If we got this grapple, what does it do? What's its purpose?
So its purpose is to grab the instruments so the robotic arm can then lift them and place them down onto the surface.
When I play these arcade games, right, they're really hard to get that toy out of the game. And you're using a mechanism that kind of reminds me of that. Is that a good idea?
So the mechanisms themselves, although they look similar, are very different. With the arcade game, when you grab that stuffed animal and you pull on that stuffed animal, you actually open the claw fingers and that stuffed animal falls out. With the InSight grapple, that mechanism is designed to latch. So once those fingers are closed, it's impossible to pull on those fingers to open it.
So how does it work?
So the grapple has 5 fingers, and we designed this grapple to maximize our success. It uses a wax actuator to open the fingers. We grab onto little hooks at the top of each instrument, and then the robotic arm picks those instruments up and places them down on the surface.
You said wax, that we're using wax to open and close the grapple?
Yeah.
Why do we use wax? Why don't we use a more typical solenoid or an electric motor?
It's actually a thoroughly proven technology. It's used in space applications like the InSight grapple, but it's also used for decades in things like our car thermostats and our appliances at home. It uses a heater to melt some wax inside of a little housing, and when this wax melts, it expands and it develops this hydraulic pressure, and that pressure pushes out a rod which we use to actuate our mechanism.
Once it's completed its primary function of putting the instruments down, what does it do after that? How does it get out of the way for other things you want to do?
So there's actually another hook on the side of the robotic arm, and the robotic arm can maneuver itself so the grapple can re-stow itself on the side of the arm. Then the arm is free to essentially do whatever it needs to do.
Nick, this grapple mechanism is truly unique. It's really fun to learn about. Thank you so much for bringing us into the test bed and answering all these questions. And as always, thank you out there for paying attention, and check back here for some more crazy engineering.
Many pilots today don't go out with an immediate concern on their flight that they're going to run into the ground.
There is a problem in aviation of controlled flight into terrain.
Controlled flight into terrain is a case where you have a perfectly healthy aircraft that is what's called under controlled flight. In other words, it hasn't stalled. The pilot has full control ability of that aircraft. Yet, the aircraft ends up running into the ground in some way.
We're developing an automatic system to avoid a ground collision in the case of a fully functional aircraft,
which will automatically take control of the aircraft and automatically fly that aircraft away from the ground to save the pilot and the vehicle.
You don't need a multi-million-dollar fighter with digital fly-by-wire flight controls and very expensive hardware to implement a system like this.
We can put these algorithms that determine if there's an imminent ground collision. We can put them on a phone, which we've demonstrated with the droid, and give out that application.
When you go from an F-16 to something like a small UAV, we unplug the F-16 model, we plug in the small UAV model, and the rest of the system remains fairly much the same.
The technology that we're developing is important. We all have friends and colleagues who aren't with us anymore because they've run into the ground.
In the fighter area, there were about 1 or 2 people dying a year in the Air Force alone due to this controlled flight in terrain problem.
And that is when an airplane in perfectly good health crashes into the ground due to either pilot error or possibly the pilot is unconscious. As in fighter jets pulling high G, they may lose consciousness.
This is something that is not just confined to military aircraft, and it's not confined to UAVs. General aviation aircraft have a big problem with running to the ground. Pilots do for whatever reason. They're distracted, they can't see, they're in a fog bank.
Another case is where they are spatially disoriented. A good example of this is the JFK Jr. mishap that happened out on the East Coast a number of years ago.
They fly in sometimes extreme landing and takeoff locations up on mountains and things where their aircrafts don't have the aerodynamic ability to climb like they think they should.
A number of years ago, the Defense Safety Oversight Council, out of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, saw this problem and asked us to begin addressing it for fighters. In conjunction with the Air Force Research Lab, and Lockheed, We went out and did an initial program on the F-16 that would help address the problem on all Air Force fighters.
The ground collision avoidance maneuver chosen for the F-16 is a wings level climb. It climbs really well and it doesn't turn very well. So we don't try to turn in front of an obstacle, we try to climb up over the top of the obstacle. So regardless of what position you are in the F-16, if there's an impending collision, the airplane will roll to wings level and begin a 5 to 6 G wings level pull to clear the local terrain.
Okay, you're gonna roll inverted, pull the nose down. It's gonna roll itself upright and pull. Bingo. That's all automatic.
When you have that kind of automatic computer actuation of a decision, and you have to take into consideration a few more things than a warning system would. Don't make things worse is the first requirement. The second one is don't get in the way of normal piloting activities. And then the third is actually avoid collisions.
You got an autopilot that has the ability to really move this airplane around. We have the ability to put 6 Gs on this airplane. 6 Gs is not an easy thing to withstand. Fighter pilots get used to it, but still 6 Gs when you didn't ask for it is a surprise, and it's really going to get somebody upset if it didn't have to happen.
Pull up, pull up, pull
It's
up,
just downright
pull
annoying.
up. Altitude.
What ends up happening is, after a few false warnings in the cockpit, a pilot either tunes out the warnings or turns the system off, and now that warning system provides no benefit.
In a fighter airplane, these collision avoidance maneuvers are very aggressive, so when they happen when they shouldn't, it's going to get away of the mission and it's going to upset the pilot severely. So avoiding nuisances in a fighter airplane is extremely important.
Their concern was that they weren't going to be able to carry out their mission and that the system was going to interfere. When they were shown that they could still do their mission and the system would actually wait longer than they would before initiating a recovery, they realized that this is not going to be a problem.
We believe that the system we developed in the ACAP program that's being fielded in the F-16 now will prevent above 90%, maybe as much as 98% of the mishaps.
We went out and tested the system against every historical category of controlled flight and terrain mishap that the F-16 has seen and based them on actual mishap cases. And we showed that across the envelope of operation of the system, it prevented every single mishap. We wanted to set up a system that would be easy to adapt to any different aircraft. At the heart of that is a modular software architecture.
And these pieces could be replaced, like an F-16 piece could be removed from the system and then a UAV piece inserted in, and then the rest of the algorithms could remain the same.
The F-16 represents the high performance top end of the performance spectrum. Airplanes that go real fast, climb real well, have great climb performance, but because they're going fast, their lateral turn performance is not as good.
In the case of a small UAV aircraft, like the Droid, we have a limited climb performance, something very typical of a general aviation aircraft. That performance model is very different.
And hopefully by anchoring both ends of that spectrum, we cover everything in between.
I think it makes it a lot more plausible that we could move to a different aircraft all across the spectrum of aviation.
One of the main costs in bringing any kind of a capability to an aircraft is the actual hardware.
A very small difference in where the airplane actually goes.
We had an eye in the future, and we recognized that eventually we wanted to get this into the general aviation community. And the best way to get something into the general aviation community would be to put something on tools that would be readily accessible to them.
So we moved the software from high-dollar fighter hardware processors to cell phone. And we've now migrated it onto a cell phone app.
At bare minimum, an app that would warn you. The more advanced versions would tie into an autopilot and actually take control and recover the aircraft. Not all general aviation airplanes have the autopilot that would be necessary, but at the bare minimum, it's an app that you can put on your cell phone and you would get a warning that you're about to run into something.
And that has enabled this technology to be potentially brought to the rest of the public for a much broader application and life savings.
I couldn't tell on that very first run.
The basic pieces that are needed to make this system work are an understanding of where the aircraft is. This is provided through GPS. You also need ground view. So we have a computer model of the world that is a digital database of elevations. We then, inside the software, have a model of how well the aircraft can perform. And that model is very precisely tuned to that aircraft's performance capability.
Even since they first started developing this capability back in the 90s, capabilities of computers have gotten much, much better. The capabilities of GPS navigation systems have become better. The terrain database that allows the aircraft to know where the ground is, where the mountains and the valleys are, has gotten a lot better.
What we did was, how we kind of overcame that is we had to go to different sources, and we kind of have this mishmash of sources that are at different resolutions and different accuracies, and we put those together into our, a custom database that really I think is tailored more to what we're doing with AutoGCAS than the original databases were.
We have built a utility that compresses this terrain into a rather small file size such that we can carry the entire globe on the phone.
So we got a homogeneous, much more accurate digital terrain database to use now. So by using improved digital terrain, we get improved performance, and then by using improved...
The system monitors the approach of the ground and the aircraft's ability to maneuver to avoid it.
It predicts an escape trajectory that keeps the aircraft on a forward trajectory but pulls it up away from the ground. But it also computes a trajectory that moves the aircraft to the right and one that moves the aircraft to the left.
It compares these two things, the terrain and the aircraft's ability to avoid it.
If the system thinks that the aircraft is in trouble, it will select the last possible option of those three trajectories.
It isn't forced to try and climb over it, it can turn to the side of it. That's unique to the droid system that we've developed, and that is a feature that will likely have a great advantage when we take it and apply it to general aviation aircraft. On a typical day of flight, the team shows up here, and early in the morning we gather all our gear, we load it into our command and control van, head out into the field, assemble the aircraft, set up our systems, and then go through a series of tests.
Our first flight's going to be against that hill, pilot flown through the gap, and we're using 2 VHF frequencies for...
What I've been doing is operating our user interface, which is the link really between us on the ground, the test team, and the phone.
When we do a run, we actually set up the autopilot through the ground and control station. We give it a point that it's going to fly to that's actually under the ground. We're telling it to, really run into the ground. The system is monitoring this, and at the last instant disengages that autopilot system and uses the auto collision avoidance system to take control of the aircraft and avoid hitting the ground. Just over the course of our testing, and we went through our testing as rapidly as we could, there were no fewer than 5 fatalities and 7 mishaps that we could have prevented with that software on the very fighter aircraft that we were trying to design it for.
I think the system we're fielding now with the F-16 isn't perfect, but I think everybody in the field is going to love it, and I think it'll save lives.
Do we have the perfect answer? Of course we don't have the perfect answer, and that's something that's going to evolve over time.
But we're trying to save lives. We're trying to save pilots and passengers' lives from controlled flight and terrain.
NASA is taking the risk, and the Air Force is taking the risk to put the system on, and I really do that it'll be game-changing and save a lot of lives and really be a benefit to society and really show what's possible.
I think it's a system whose time has come. There's no major obstacles from a technology standpoint. It does take work, it does take development effort, it takes flight tests to prove it.
The technology is out there to do this. It's a matter of bringing all the pieces together and sewing it together with software to make the capability happen.
On a remote peninsula in the South Pacific, a rocket and 10 small satellites are about to launch a new era in spaceflight. Rocket Lab's Electron rocket is a new player in the space arena, and those tiny spacecraft, called CubeSats, represent big dreams.
It's kind of like the preeminent, most exciting mission within the whole company. The whole team is just incredibly excited to have that NASA logo on the side of the vehicle and fly those payloads.
The NASA payload about to launch on the Electron rocket is called ELANA 19. ELANA stands for Educational Launch of Nanosat, providing a path to space for satellites that pack a lot of science into a package about the size of a loaf of bread.
Space is no longer just for high-value science or the intelligence community. It is a place for a payload that you can create that can get up to space.
Until now, CubeSats have always launched with larger spacecraft, but flying as a hitchhiker limited where they could go and the science they could do. That's what makes this Rocket Lab flight so historic. It's the first time these small satellites are the stars of their own show, flying on a rocket designed for their needs. The 10 CubeSats flying on ELANA 19 were developed by teams from across the nation, from high schools and universities to NASA field centers. Da Vinci was developed by a student-led team at North Idaho STEM Charter Academy. It's designed to connect to students around the world by broadcasting education-related messages through amateur radio in Morse code. It also carries a Global Star modem and ArduCam, allowing users to upload digital messages or see photos of Earth from orbit.
I don't know if anyone remembers like the Ovaltine messages and stuff on the radio way back when, but our goal is to do something like that where they have to tune in every week or every other week to get this new message and decode it and really dive into that information so that they develop an interest in space and they say, oh, hey, I can communicate with something that's not even on this planet.
RSAT was developed by a team of midshipmen from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. This crab-like CubeSat has a pair of robotic arms designed to grab a host satellite and maneuver around it to take photos, or potentially even make repairs if a spacecraft isn't working properly. The CubeSat STF-1, or Simulation to Flight 1, is a collaboration between NASA Independent Verification and Validation Program with West Virginia University and small businesses. STF-1 will monitor space weather over Earth's poles and test the durability of new materials for use in LEDs. But it's also designed to demonstrate a simulation and test platform to aid in the development of future CubeSat missions. These CubeSats show that small satellites have an important and growing role in space exploration. NASA's Venture Class Launch Service was created in 2015 to provide CubeSats their own ride to space, expanding launch and science opportunities for small satellites and sparking a brand new segment of the space launch industry. Rocket Lab's Electron rocket is one of 2 vehicles NASA selected for Venture Class missions. It's smaller and lighter than other launchers in NASA's stable, but that's the whole point.
The intent is for the Venture Class launches to occur at a rapid pace that match the iteration and design cycle that CubeSats can go through. So instead of having a launch for a primary mission once every 2 years, once every 5 years, the real goal is to see Venture Class rockets get to a cadence where they can see regular access to orbit.
Many of the CubeSats on the ELANA 19 mission are designed to benefit future missions. Shields 1 was developed by NASA's Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. Its objective? To test materials that could be used to shield spacecraft against radiation.
This is a radiation effects experiment where we're looking at the performance of the materials and the electronics, and it would have a potentially large impact for improving performance of future spacecraft.
NMTSat was built by approximately 50 undergraduate and graduate students, primarily from New Mexico Tech in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's designed to use onboard sensors to collect data on Earth's magnetic field, take atmospheric weather measurements, and carry out an optical beacon experiment. The next spacecraft was developed by teams on opposite sides of the country, in Florida and California. It's called CHOMPT, which stands for CubeSat Handling of Multi-System Precision Time Transfer. This